Oops. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, y'all. So we'll just take a moment for folks to get themselves in, get themselves settled down. How's Yvette start their sessions? Everybody go ahead and pour your libation. Everybody come on, pour your libation. Do whatever it is you need to do to get settled. And in just a moment, we're gonna jump in. Hold on, I gotta medicate Jack here. Forgive me, y'all. Come on, Jack. Come on. Come on, bud. Good boy. Had to give Jack his little medication this morning before I forget. It's a busy day today. It's a busy weekend. I had several several obligations. One of them was yesterday. The second I think I told some folks in if people have been keeping up with these 3-minute videos. I don't know if people are aware that I have a YouTube channel. If you're watching here, obviously this is for those of you watching it on YouTube. You're seeing it on the YouTube channel, but people may or may not be aware that I've been trying to get back on track with posting regularly, and I've been posting every day just a 3-minute video, just a little 3-minute video, just a little to touch base, just to get in the practice of posting regularly again. It was just getting really challenging, especially towards the end of the semester last year. I should say end of the semester, throughout the semester last year, as I was teaching, writing a play, and participating in programs with a theater company that I founded and that I'm the artistic director, of which I'm artistic director. So having all those things, it was really difficult last year to post every day. So I'm just getting into a practice of just posting just a little check-in every day, and who knows what form that'll take, but just getting into that practice so that I can get my workflow going. Because it was just really hard, just the daunting task of making a video and then editing the video and then posting the video and all these things. And I don't want to complain because that's just the nature of the beast. But I don't really, I'm not doing this for the money, so it's a lot to ask. Anyway, so that's what that is. But today we're going to jump back in with our study group, our Pedagogy of the Oppressed study group, working from the text by Paulo Freire. So for those of you who missed last week, we did a little orientation where we talked about what this process is going to be like, and the idea that, each week over the next several months, we're going to be looking at a chapter from Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed. We'll start with this little check-in that we're doing right now. Start with a look in. And then we're going to jump in with reflections from last week. And last week I offered some reflections for folks to help, wrap yourselves around what's going on in chapter 1 of Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed. And so I'm hoping that today we'll hear back from some of you with your responses to those reflections, and I hope that's going to happen today. I hope raise your hand. Give me number 1 if your expectation today is to is to offer your reflections, your responses to the reflections from last week. Otherwise I have a lot of material here that I can, fill the time with if we need to. And the material off is obviously some responses, some general responses to those reflections, some things that might be included, and those are added also to fortify anything that's been shared by folks who've guested today. And that's my hope, is that people are going to guest today. Um, I have some background, and I think that I'm going to actually start today with a little bit of background of what was going on in Brazil, just a little something so that we can offer some context for what this work is coming out of, what was happening in Brazil at the time that Paulo Freire was engaged in work there, and then that I'm guessing inspired the writing of Pedagogy and Theory of the Oppressed, and many of his writings on education, liberatory education specifically. And then I'm going to offer, towards the end of this broadcast, I'm going to offer you just a brief synopsis of chapter 2, and then send you off with some reflections to consider while you read through chapter 2, and then we'll talk about your responses to those in the next video. Does that sound about right to people? Does it sound about right for what? Does that sound like what you were expecting? So far, and I didn't even check in. Can everybody hear me? Because right now there have not been any direct responses to anything that I've said. So I'm just wondering if folks are can hear. I hope people can hear generally. Okay. Ananda says, I'm here, but have the flu. I feel bad. That's awful. That's awful. I'm really grateful I've avoided being sick. Do we have a troll? So we have a couple of folks who are here but have the flu. That's gonna be okay, because I have, like I said, I have material here that will fill, to fill the session, so folks will have lots to consider. And I know how these things go, because it's Sunday and y'all at home, and you know, it's all fine and dandy for me to offer some reflections and send everybody off, and yeah, everybody's going to do their homework and this and that and the other thing. But I know people have lives. I understand. There's no shame. No shame. No shame in that. So just a little bit of understanding of what was going on. So in Brazil, there was, as there exists in many places in the world today, there was a huge gap between, the elite, who held most of the wealth, and you had 70% of the population in poverty, and 70% of the population illiterate. And it's in that context that Paulo Freire began his practice in terms of liberatory education for the oppressed, for this addressing the needs of the 70% of the population who were poor and illiterate. And if you were illiterate, if you couldn't read in Brazil at the time, you couldn't vote. You couldn't vote. And so he was, helping to materially improve the situation of the poor by teaching people how to read, so that they could have so they could participate in the political process. And then during that time, there was a military coup in Brazil, and this coup was supported by the United States and led to a repressive authoritarian government which lasted for about 20 years in Brazil. And during that time, the country engaged in the torture, the arrest, of civilian dissidents. People were exiled or forced to flee the country. They removed political officials. To extinguish left-wing opponents, the dictatorship used arbitrary arrest, imprisonment without trials, kidnapping, and most of all, torture, which included rape and castration. So we're talking about a repressive, violent, authoritarian government in Brazil. Paulo Freire is one of the first dissidents to be arrested, spent about 2 months in prison, and then was exiled. And it was during this period that Paulo Freire is in exile that he pens Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which he wrote the English version while in residence at Harvard. So he was in the United States when the English version, he did his own English translation of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or while he was a part of the translation of Pedagogy of the Oppressed into English while he was at Harvard. Right, and by the way, this is this version that I'm working from is the 30th anniversary edition. Right, and so that's the context. That's the social context within which Pedagogy of the Oppressed is being written, based on work that's happening in the midst of an incredible gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that's a term that's going to come up again during our discussion today. So that's where we are. And so today we're talking about chapter 1 and responding to some of the reflections, offering some answers to some of the reflections that were offered last week. So in overview, in chapter 1, Paulo Freire suggests as the central problem of humankind, humanization as the central problem, concern of humankind. He also presents this idea that if we have humanization as the central problem of humankind, we have its opposite, the existence or the possibility of its opposite, which is dehumanization. He points out that as human beings, we understand ourselves as incomplete, and that our humanization is our ontological vocation. And dehumanization is a distortion of that vocation. He talks about this idea of the potential for social transformation that exists, but that this transformation, he talks about it as revolution, is not possible without a critical pedagogy wherein the oppressed recognize themselves as fully responsible for the struggle, for their own humanization. A struggle which they must commit themselves to. And he talks about the conviction that is necessary and that can't be achieved except through something that he calls praxis. Something that he calls praxis. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and I'm going to frame it in terms of the reflections that I offered last week. So first of all, good morning. Good morning. Melissa loves everyone. Thank you for joining the broadcast. So one of the first things that I asked was, what are the relationships that are discussed, and how are they defined? And I don't know if I talked specifically in terms of oppression, oppressed and oppression, and those definitions. I don't think I talked about them. I certainly did not talk about the definition, but these relationships, the relationship between the oppressed and the oppressors that are discussed in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, obviously, yes? So before I jump in, is there anyone who has anything that they'd like to offer, any thoughts that they'd like to offer before I continue, which I'm happy to continue. So if you haven't if you haven't had an opportunity to watch the first video last week and hear the reflections and give it a try, and you're trying to follow along and you want to do your homework before before you skip to the back of the book and hear the answers, I would say stop watching this video right now, because I'm going to bring down, and I don't want you to think about these as the answers, but I would like you to think about them as some things that I've drawn from my reading, and that they may not be in line with how you interpret the chapter. Right? So I don't want to come at this as like I have all the knowledge and I'm going to tell you what it all means, but I just want you to walk away with some things that I've drawn from my reading of the text, and hope that you have some things that are your reading of the text. And if you hear something, if I say something and you're like, no, that's not right, be ready to jump into the guest queue and challenge me. But so one of the first things is like, how are the relationships defined? And so Paulo Freire defines oppression as any situation in which A exploits B or hinders their pursuit of self-affirmation as a responsible person. And that shows up on page 55 of my edition of the book. It shows up on page 55. He considers that anything interfering with an individual's ontological and historical vocation to be more human. He says that anything that interferes with this ontological vocation should be considered as violence. In fact, he considers the very establishment of a relationship of oppression as violence. And then when we talk about, the historical roles, I'm just like how the different ways that those characters in the oppressor-oppressed relationship might be seen, and that's, from the point of view of the oppressor or from the point of view of the oppressed. And throughout the chapter, Paulo Freire offers us several different ways of defining that relationship. So there's obviously the oppressor and the oppressed relationship, right? Those who are the target of the dehumanizing action, and those who are taking away the humanity of others. He talks about them as the haves and the have-nots, those who have and those who don't have. He talks about this idea of prescription, and those who prescribe and for whom they have prescribed a reality. He talks about them being, in fact, oppressors by their virtue of having, and the transformation of others into things, materialism. This idea that nature, animals, thoughts, other human beings can all be reduced to objects. He talks about the oppressors as sadists and their targets. He talks about them as he talks about them as necrophiliacs. The oppressors as necrophiliacs for their desire to inanimate others and turn them into dead things, that their fascination is with death. Obviously, there is the consumer and their relation to others as commodities. He talks about violence engendering an entire way of life. Those who are capable, those who are incapable. Those who own knowledge and those who are ignorant. So these are the historic roles that Paulo Freire outlines in chapter 1. And then I asked the question about who is responsible then for overcoming and transforming this situation. Who is responsible for the transformation? And that's, to me, it seems pretty obvious that it's the oppressed. The oppressed are responsible. And Paulo Freire says that is the great historical task of the oppressed to liberate themselves and their oppressors, and only the power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both the oppressed and their oppressors. He points out the fact that it would be a contradiction for the oppressor to engage in the process of liberation. It is not in their interest. And I talked about this a little bit last week in one of my videos where I was saying, are we heading towards, are we heading towards our destruction, or are we evolving in ways that we might prevent that destruction? And of course, for many of us, especially, if we're middle class and if we adhere to the oppressors, we benefit from the oppression that happens around the world. It's not in our interest to even see it as a possibility that the oppressed may rise up someday, Um, so it would be, again, it would be a contradiction to think that the oppressors would participate in any way in the liberation of the oppressed, right? And he also talks about this as a two-stage process. One, first stage in overcoming the existing distortion is that there needs to be an unveiling of the world of oppression and an action and reflection that he calls praxis. And praxis being a critical awareness of the concrete circumstances of oppression and the critical intervention to transform that concrete situation. He calls that praxis, right? And the idea that we don't even understand oppression until we intervene. We don't understand oppression takes its shape through the intervention, through those attempts to overcome the oppression, to break the oppression as it reasserts itself. As oppression reasserts itself, that's where the violence, that's where we see it manifesting itself in violence, in violent repression, right? And then he imagines in stage two, the pedagogy of the oppressed becomes the pedagogy of the people, because the oppression would be overcome through liberatory practice. And so that becomes the pedagogy of the people, right? So it's not simply a pedagogy for one group versus another. It becomes the pedagogy of all people, and a unification that happens in this process. So moving on, Freire talks about, my next question was, what are the several steps in the process of liberation? What are the steps that we have to take? And just generally speaking, the pedagogy of the oppressed is the process, right? So he outlines the process concretely in this book through the several chapters. Yes, and just an overarching statement about that process. The pedagogy of the oppressed is a pedagogy forged with the oppressed that makes oppression itself the object of reflection to inform a struggle for liberation. Generally speaking, that's the process. And then some steps that I was able to draw from reading chapter 1 is required in that process is the critical recognition of the concrete situation and the causes of oppression. Right? And I feel like this is a step, everybody gets that step. Everybody gets that step. Right? Everybody understands this idea of recognizing the situation of oppression, right? You hear it when we talk about racism, when we talk about sexism, when we talk about, as vegans, when we talk about what happens to animals, we're talking about the concrete situation, right? And we may have individuals who want to go a step further and talk about the causes of the root causes of those oppression, right? So that's what I've listed as number one. You may have something else listed as number one, right? And there's the understanding oppression as a limiting situation that can be transformed, right? An important step. Understanding oppression as a limiting situation that can be transformed. I don't know why I'm repeating myself, because you guys will all have the power to, well, when people are watching this on YouTube, they'll have the power to pause and write things down, right? I'm also going to include at least a link to all of these notes. I'll put a PDF up somewhere and then include a link to this so that people will have these notes, right? Okay, we're also required a critical awareness acquired through the praxis of struggle to transform the concrete situation. Right? I already talked about this as not only is there required a critical awareness, but critical intervention. So critical awareness acquired through the praxis of struggle to transform the concrete situation. He also uh, talks about all of us in creative communion working collectively, that this is not a revolution of one. This is not a struggle of one person. Hey, Chichikov, welcome. This is not a struggle for one person. This is all of us in creative communion, working in creative communion. I love anything that uses the word creative, right? As an artist, right? He also it calls for an understanding of ourselves as hosts of the oppressor and critical self-awareness. And Paulo Freire talks about us, as those who are shaped in in a context, in an oppressive context. Our entire realities have been shaped in an oppressive context, and being shaped within an oppressive context. We have to understand that our psyche is formed in that context, and we have internalized a lot of the ideologies that exist within that context, right? So understanding that and being vigilant about that. Understanding both the oppressor and the oppressed as manifestations of dehumanization. So it's not as if, so when we talk about, this is really interesting because Tawana Petty, who I've interviewed on the YouTube channel, and who is a colleague of mine here in Detroit, talks often about this idea of we need to move away from this idea of privilege, talking about privilege, the privilege of being an oppressor, right? It's a role, and there are benefits to being an oppressor, but in the fact that it is a dehumanized state, we should maybe try to reframe our language, right? It's a distortion. It's a distortion, right? Or a social sickness to be an oppressor, right? And so understanding that both of these things are dehumanizing. Also understanding that we are the fruits of an historical and sociological situation, right? Which goes back to what I mentioned before, that we that we are the host of our oppressor because we are the result of an historical and sociological situation. Paulo Freire talks about something that is required in this idea of a struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors, that it's not simply about a reversal of roles. It is not about the oppressed overcoming the oppressors and then becoming their oppressors. He talks about it as the creation of a new being, a new type of being, which is a challenge because we don't have a model for that being, because we live in a society where we are mostly either in the role of the oppressor or agents or adherents to the oppressor or the oppressed. He talks about this idea, the notion of revolutionary leadership and understanding themselves as co-learners in the unveiling of reality, the demystification of oppression through common reflection and action, which is praxis, right? Action and reflection combine are praxis. So that's the word of the day. Paulo Freire talks about, and it's interesting because I've done several videos talking about dialogue, and I wasn't consciously aware at the time that I was making those videos that I was being influenced by my adherence to Paulo Freire and his work. But dialogue as the only means of revolutionary leadership to engage with the oppressed. Dialogue is the only means for revolutionary leadership to engage with the oppressed. And that dialogue with the oppressed and among the oppressed, it must occur at the level of the level that reality is perceived right? So making sure that when we step into practice or, this liberatory practice, that we are considering where we are, where's everybody in the room, and how are they seeing the world, and starting with that and building from there, as opposed to entering the room and saying, "Hey, everybody, you're oppressed. you're oppressed. This is how. This is why." And okay, we got to go and we got to change the situation. But that's not really a liberatory practice, right? Liberatory practice requires saying, "Hey, what is the world? What is the world that you live in, and how would you like to see that world transformed?" Okay, so those were the steps, the requirements that are outlined by Paulo Freire. So hello to anybody who's joining us. So we're just going through talking about the reflections from last week and some possible responses that you may have come up with. Obviously, there are other um, interpretations of the chapter, but I'm just these are some things that I pulled. There's a lot in the chapter. It's only about 20. It's only about 20 pages, maybe 15 pages tops, but there's a lot packed in there. It's pretty dense. So I hope that this brings some clarity, right? And so then the other thing that I talked about are several obstacles that Paulo Freire talks about, discusses to prevent revolutionary action, to prevent liberatory practice. And many of you, I'm drinking a green smoothie, by the way. This is collard greens, banana, a little fresh squeezed OJ, and pineapple. And it's pretty thick because I wanted to get an entire head of collard greens in there and have it fit in a jar. And it's delicious. So I just want you all to know that that's what I'm enjoying this morning. So now I want to talk about the obstacles. And I'm going to talk about the obstacles from two different perspectives. I'm going to talk about obstacles in terms of the oppressed, right? Things that, conditions of the oppressed. Matt Blender, how you doing? First of all, I want to just give another breath. How's everybody doing? Are folks keeping up? Am I clear? Does anybody have any questions? Is there anybody who wants to jump on and guess a little bit and talk a little bit about your reading? Any of those things, please feel free, right? And also, I just want to because if folks weren't here if folks weren't here, good. What's going on? Well, we're continuing with our little theater, pedagogy of the oppressed study group, which is probably now going to end up being like a series of lecture videos, but that's all right. Whatever sounds good for people. But we're continuing with our conversation of pedagogy of the oppressed. For anybody who doesn't know already, I am on the last year I was the lead organizer for the 22nd Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed conference. The 23rd, I'm one of the organizers and doing some support, basically trying to do for them what I did last year. Good. I'm glad you're there. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because Mad Blender is in the room, and I just wanted to remind Mad Blender, because our next conference is going to be in Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh, in Indiana, Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And that's going to be happening from the 7th through the 10th of June. And I believe prior to the conference, there's going to be a 3-day intensive with Julian Boal. If people are familiar at all with Theater of the Oppressed, of which I'm a practitioner, Augusto Boal is the founder of the Theater of the Oppressed. His son is one of the leading practitioners of Theater of the Oppressed, Julian Boal, who's going to be there offering this workshop. So I'm just plugging those things. It's not shameless self-promotion, but I am plugging those things. I will certainly be there, and I am likely going to be bringing the production of Black Conference that I'm going to be producing with Falconworks Theater Company. So that's all of that. All right, so I'm going to continue with the next question. So I was going to talk about what are the obstacles to doing this work. And again, some of you talked about these things last week. Like one of the main questions that popped up is like, how can you do this work with people and everybody's so ignorant and people don't know people don't know anything, and how do you expect people who are just ill-informed, who do not understand the situation that they're in, to take part in their own liberation? And that is a major concern. It's a major concern. And I think it stops a lot of people in their tracks from wanting to do work, or at least to do work in a liberatory fashion. It's so easy to make a plan and implement that plan on people, right? Here's the solution. I'm just going to put this solution on y'all, right? That's the world we live in. That is the dominant cultural mode, as I like to say. And Paulo Freire it recognizes that there are challenges, and some of these challenges are that in the process of reaching critical awareness, almost always, Paulo Freire says, almost always the oppressed become oppressors. And and I'm sure that as I say these things, I bet everybody's like, oh, I know that feeling, right? People talk about the regressive left, right? It is almost always, Paulo Freire says, that in the process, the oppressed almost always become oppressors. And he offers reasons for this too, right? What is the model for humanity that we have in our, present society, right? Who do we aspire to be? Right? Our model for humanity are oppressors, the wealthy, right? The smart people, the ruling class, right? Who wouldn't want to be that? Have all that money, have all that influence, have control of all those resources. So Paulo Freire points that out, that is a challenge. Paulo Freire points out the oppressed have been conditioned within the state of their oppression to view the oppressors as the model of humanity for which to strive. He points out that recognition of their state as the oppressed is not the struggle. Matt Blender said, that's deep. I'm here. It's deep. But hey, yeah, thank you for the 400 likes. Yeah, it's deep, but hey, that's where we are, right? Paulo Freire says people don't necessarily want to be free. People don't necessarily want to be free. They would prefer one of they would rather be the preferred of the recognized possibilities. So if the possibilities that you see is, I'm either going to be the person getting a face stepped on, or I'm going to be the person stepping on somebody's face. If you have to choose, if the only choices you believe exist are stepping on someone's face or having your face stepped on, it might be reasonable that people would choose to be the person stepping on somebody else's face, right? People lack the ability to imagine another possibility, right? And the other possibility is liberation from that model altogether. People fear repression for ourselves and others around us, that the work that we do to transform society may result in violent repression from whoever the oppressors are, however we want to, label them. It's a real fear. And not only for ourselves, but others around us. So it's not just what's going to happen to me, but what might I bring down on others, right? Because, the result is not going to be, it may not just be someone being arrested or someone being killed, but it might be policies that are put in place that increase the level of repression for others. Yes? There is the sense of ourselves as incapable of running the risks of struggle as an obstacle. And then somebody talked about this idea of, we cater to the oppressors, right? We try to make the oppressors like us. We try to get the oppressors to see us as human. And when they recognize us as human, see how gregarious, Paulo Freire actually uses the word gregarious, that is going to lead to some major transformation. But Paulo Freire points out that that's not That's not it. The best that we can, expect from the oppressors when we come to them in that way is false generosity, right? They're going to give us just enough to keep our hands trembling. Oh, please more, please give me more, right? And this is, think about this in terms of what the society that we experience, or that you experience, right? That we see these, charity not as a way to develop people, but just to, give them just enough so that we feel better about the state that they're in, and so that they feel better about the state that they're in, as if you could purchase someone's humanity. But that's ultimately what it boils down to, is purchase of humanity of others. And then for the oppressors, maybe some thoughts around the oppressors. Those were the thoughts around the oppressed that make this work challenging, right? And then from the oppressors, this idea that it is a radical posture for the oppressor to step into the role of the oppressed. But Paulo Freire makes clear that that is necessary. That if anyone from the ranks of the oppressors wants to be an ally, they have to step into the role of the oppressed. Lovelight Ananda says, great example, fake pastor Mark Burns on AM Joy yesterday. Oh, I should check that out. So that's an example for people of what I've just been talking about. And I'm thinking that this is the gregariousness that you're talking about, Ananda. Yeah. All right, I'm going to keep moving through here. Right? We'll keep moving through. We have a little bit of time left. So for the oppressors, some things that will cause this to be challenging, right? We talked about this that it's a radical posture for the oppressor to step into the role of the oppressed, right? Right? And seeing the oppressed, as opposed to seeing the oppressed as people who inherently are flawed, understanding the oppressed as people who have been unjustly dealt with, deprived of voice, and cheated in the sale of their labor. Right? What's wrong with them? Like we, the oppressors, we in our role as, agents and adherents to the oppressor, looking at the oppressed and saying, they're broken, as opposed to seeing them as the results of the cheating, of the historical cheating, the oppressive action, the violence that has been taken, right? He talks about the rationalization that occurs when one's class interests are threatened by their perception of reality, right? So if I'm suddenly realizing, ooh, all this land that I've been living on is the result of the violence that occurred against the indigenous people here, right? Then I might start to make all kinds of rationalizations, and you hear them. Oh, that was the past. That wasn't my family. My family didn't own slaves, right? I don't know. And again, these aren't the definitive answers. These are just things that I've drawn from this, right? The oppressor class and its adherents, which include the oppressed. Some of the oppressed can be included in as adherents to the oppressor class. So you might find a lot of people who should recognize themselves as oppressed, not recognizing themselves as oppressed because they are adhering to the oppressor class. They only understand themselves in terms of the possession of the world. I can do what I want because it's mine. I can do what I want to those animals because they belong to us. Right? I can do what I want to those people in Africa because we own that. We own, the United States. We own America. We can do what we want because we possess. We see these things as our possession. We don't see ourselves as part of a whole. Right? As part of an ecosystem. We see ourselves above and over that system as the owners of that system. Right? We don't understand that our entire way of life is engendered by violence. We're blind to it. It's interesting. Um, hey, veganista, welcome. Ananda says lies. The insistence that the oppressor is right, right? This is coming. Yeah, this is coming. This is coming. Veganista says wiping sleep from eyes, yawn, morning. Welcome, 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 Chichikov. Oh, thank you. I don't know why I'm wearing red today. I feel like, am I trying to, am I making a statement about communism? Not really. Maybe I just want to match the book. I don't know. I don't know. The book is red, y'all. I don't know if you can see. It's got a little glow, but it's red. Yes. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, more challenges that arise out of the perceptions of the oppressors, right? Um, that there are prejudices and deformations about the oppressed. They can't think. They can't want. They can't know. So even when adherents to the oppressors try to step into a role as allies, it becomes a challenge because they've internalized these beliefs about the oppressed as incapable. And so then they feel that they must do the transforming because they do not trust in people. And trust in people, Paulo Freire makes very clear, is a precondition of revolutionary change. Trust in people is a precondition of revolutionary change, right? And I don't know if any of you have read Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky, in his Reveille for Radicals, spends an entire chapter talking about the necessity of love for people to be an activist, to be an organizer, that there has to be a deep love for people. This is not something that you can move into in contempt for people, in contempt for humanity, right? Right. He stresses the importance of communion with people, right? Which is something that I talked about already as part of the requirements, being in communion with people. And then, so those were the obstacles. Those are some of the things preventing us from moving into this revolution liberatory practice. These beliefs, these understandings on the side of the oppressed and on the side of the oppressors. So I asked the question about, I asked what was the central question that Freire poses as the problem in the process of liberation, and how does it affect, and I asked people to talk about how it affects their work, and maybe somebody's going to want to jump on and guest after I've offered these things. And also, if you're listening to this right now and you want to jump on just and respond to any of that, feel free. Don't feel like if you jump on, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions and like mark you wrong if you haven't, prepared something. So don't worry about that. It ain't that kind of show. But in terms of the central problem, um, uh, and he says the central problem. Well, first of all, the central problem, the central concern he talks about for humanity is its own humanization, right? He talks about that. But then within the chapter, he talks about how can the oppressed, as divided, unauthentic beings, participate in developing the pedagogy of their liberation, right? And then I go on to like ask what would it mean to be truly autonomous and responsible after so long living under the prescription of oppression? Can the oppressed emerge from their role? And right, that really is like that's the central theme of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is can the oppressed emerge from their role to take on what Paulo Freire says is their historic responsibility in the restoration from the distortion that is the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. Is it even possible? And if so, what? And of course, he outlines it he outlines a theory for that change, for that transformation in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So then I asked the question about key terms introduced in the chapter. So I talked about false generosity already. This idea of a false generosity that is nourished by death, despair, and poverty. I talked about praxis already as this process of action and reflection, or a critical analysis and a critical intervention. Right. Yeah. Veganista says, can they emerge from their role again? Do they realize they're being oppressed? Right. And so these are, again, these are all things that are being addressed in pedagogy of the oppressed, right? And we're gonna be introduced to a process in the later chapters, right? But these are the central questions in this chapter, right? He talks about adhesion, which I already talked about. This adhesion, the oppressed, and their adhesion to their oppressors, right? Admiration even of their oppressors, desire to be the oppressor. It's about prescription, this idea that oppression as a prescription for others, uh, that's imposed by the oppressed. This idea of authenticity, right, which is something that will need to be achieved for the oppressed to engage in this work. In answer to your, in part answer to Veganista, in part answer to your question, talks about conscientization, right, which is that process of raising one's awareness, raising one's critical awareness, which is a slow process wherein the oppressed do come to realize their state, their historic role as an oppressed class, not simply as beings within a system where they serve a function for the oppressors, but their own seeing themselves as the opposite, not simply as tools of an oppressor class, but as the opposites of that class, right? And step out of their role as servants to that class and step into conflict with that class. I want to talk a little bit about violence here because it's something, I mean, because I'm sure you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, what is it going to look like? What does this revolution look like? And I don't want to pretend that this is a whole Pollyanna thing, right? Because Paulo Freire addresses this idea of violence. He divides it into two categories. He says that there's violence that deprives others of their humanity. And there is violence that is grounded in the desire to pursue the right to be human. Violence that deprives others of their humanity, and violence grounded in the desire to pursue the rights to be human. Paulo Freire says, never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. Their very existence is the result of pre-existing and ongoing violence. And I feel like that's something that, is rarely ever discussed. We talk about the world as if it just sprouted up out of the ground one day, and not as the result of a history of violence. If you look at the United States, if you look at Europe, if you look all around the world, right? All around the world. And I guess what is being proposed here is a way to break that cycle of violence. But Paulo Freire doesn't make any assumptions about violence not being part of a struggle to overcome oppression. He looks at the campaigns of violence in history. And so a question that I had was, when have there been campaigns? There have been violent campaigns, violent and dehumanizing campaigns throughout history. Has there ever been a large-scale campaign to restore the humanity of a group that historically had been dehumanized. Right. And I've talked about this in terms of the whole, like, slavery and racism and all that stuff. And I think I made a video called, Black People Are Stupid. But the central question of that video was, when did people in the United States stop being racist? Was there a campaign? And looking at racism as the dehumanization of people who identify as white, right? That it was something that was done to white people as well as to non-white people. And when was there a campaign to restore the humanity of those who were the tools in the construction of racism? Chichikov said Gandhi. Now, I love that you get offered, Chichikov, I love that you offered a one word answer, but I want to be like, can you come on and talk a little bit more about that? I'd love to know a little bit more. So if you want to type a little bit more, and then I'll read it as it comes in, right? Gandhi as a large campaign. Ananda says Gandhi has some racism in his own past. That's something I'd like to look into, right? And the question is, who was responsible? Was it the oppressed in Gandhi, in the campaign that you talk about with Gandhi? Is it the oppressed who are responsible for that particular campaign to restore humanity, or was it the state? Was it the state who was responsible for that? Paulo Freire talks about the restraints on those who would oppress, right? As we take away power from those who were in the role of oppressor, right? And people may have examples of how this happens today. That those restraints should not be understood as oppression, because oppression is an action that prevents others from being more human, right? Oppression is dehumanizing for both the oppressed and the oppressor, and therefore restraint of oppression, Paulo Freire says, is an act of love. He says it's an act of love because it is an act of restoring the humanity to both the oppressed and their oppressors. It is an act of love, according to Paulo Freire. Right? And then I talk about in terms of the regressive left, right? Which comes up, right? We talk about the regressive left, and we might ask, is the action that's being taken on the left depriving someone of their humanity? Are there cases of where what is happening on the left is depriving others of their humanity? And I'm not saying that this is not the case. I'm asking this question. Or is it restoring the humanity of other individuals? Right? For example, does preventing an employer from sexual harassment deprive the employer of their humanity? Right? And then we have to ask, how harassment is being defined. Right? Is this action that somehow deprives the target from pursuing their ontological vocation, if one accepts Freire's definition? Right? And Freire talks about this idea of the bureaucracy that can emerge in revolutionary process, right? Where we just become a bureaucracy. And we see examples of this, right? Where we have these arbitrary rules that are being placed on individuals that actually end up limiting people's freedom in the process of, and they're not things that they're not grassroots measures, right? It's the state stepping in and saying, okay, we prescribe this as a solution to the problem of oppression, right? It's a state-sponsored state-sponsored action, right? That people talk about, right, in terms of the regressive left, right? So we're taking away people's liberty, right? Silencing people, right? Silencing people, censorship, all of these things, right? We look at these as bureaucratic practices that may not have anything to do with liberatory practice whatsoever. I don't know, right? So those were my thoughts. And then I did a whole page by page just synopsis outline of the chapter, right? So that's all of that. So I'm going to move on. All right. So that's chapter one. That's chapter one. Um, Wait a minute, love Ananda. You said what? Of course not. I'm not sure what you. I'm not sure what you're responding to. I'm not sure what you're responding to. But let me know. Have I outraged someone? I don't know. I don't know. But these are questions. These are questions that I drew from the text, and tried to come up with some examples. But I would much prefer all of you, come up with examples from your own lives. When you were talking about sexual harassment, right? Yes. So we talk about like the ways that sexual harassment is dealt with. Is sexual harassment being dealt with in a way that is liberating to the target of that sexual harassment, or does it simply impose another prescription on top of a situation that's not going to be improved? So that's a question. That's where we could have whole debates. And I feel like that's part of the dialogue that we need to be having, not measuring things about like who feels bad, because the oppressor is always going to feel bad. The oppressor is never going to agree with any steps that are taken towards the liberation of the oppressed. Right? The oppressor is never going to agree. Right? But the question is, how do we measure liberatory action? And I'm offering as a way to measure liberatory action as we look at it as ways that humanize, that liberate individuals to pursue their own humanization, right? And there's many. I mean, we could get down. We're gonna have. I hope we have a lot of conversations about this. Obviously, people will always find loopholes in order to justify bad behavior, right? Yeah. And part of it is that, even the idea of a loophole, you find a loophole through what? Through a policy, right? A policy that who, right? As opposed to being engaged in a different kind of process with each other, where if we're in dialogue, there's no loophole. There's no loophole around dialogue, right? There's no loophole through a dialogue, right? If I'm empowered to speak, if I have voice, right? And I guess that's the question is, are we creating policies that give voice and power and agency, or are we creating policies that simply limit the behavior of one individual, right? And I'm saying that the restraints on oppression, there need to be restraints on oppression, and that should not be considered another form of oppression, right? But the focus should be on liberating the oppressed, right? Liberating the oppressed, not simply creating more ways for oppressors to oppress sub-oppressors, right? Because in most cases, the oppressors aren't being affected by any of this. We only see agents and adherents to the oppressor, people who believe the party line about women, the people who believe the party line about the old, about the infirm, about people of color, right? Those are the people who are being affected by the kinds of policy changes that we see happening in the world, right? The oppressors are going to do what the oppressors are going to do, right? And still get to be elected president of the United States. In the meantime, and we'll talk about all of them, Bill Clinton, who I'm sorry was engaged in sexual harassment, right? Abused his power in that office, right? Or Donald Trump, right? So all of that. Those people aren't. Those people still get to be in power and get to do all the things that they want to do. It's just down here in the trenches where we see people being affected by the little stopgap measures that are being taken to please us, so that we feel like them up there, right? That false generosity, right? So I'm gonna move on. Next week, y'all, at 12:07. Next week, we're gonna move on to chapter 2. In chapter 2, Freire outlines two conflicting teaching methodologies, the principles and practices of each, and the ways in which each is either a liberatory practice or an oppressive practice. Chichikov says a clever oppressor will position themselves so that they shape the narrative for reform. At least that's how the finance sector works. I'm going to put it this way, Chichikov. The oppressor doesn't even have to be clever. The oppressor doesn't have to be clever because they have all the power. They don't have to be clever, right? It's the agents of oppression that need to be clever, right? Because that's the person who comes face to face, right? We don't get access to the oppressor. We never have access to the oppressor, ever. Right? We only have access to the agents, to their agents, right? They can't be bothered with us. They don't even come out, right? We don't move. They exist in a whole other world, right? A whole other world. And they may not even know the results of their action, right? But yeah, I agree with you that, the clever agents position themselves so that they shape the narrative, right? And they actually do the agents do that shaping, right? And it's all part of it. It's all false generosity. Even the speaking to us, the oppressor lending any voice whatsoever to a concern of the oppressed is an act of false generosity. Oh, you poor. Oh, yes, that must be terrible for you. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, here's what I'll do. Won't solve it. I'm not gonna shift the relation. I'm not gonna give you your power. I'm not gonna give you your humanity back, but I'll give you a lollipop. And that'll be cute. Okay, continuing next week. Okay, so next week, as I said before, chapter 2, Freire outlines two conflicting teaching methodologies, the principles and practices of each, and the ways in which each is either a liberatory practice or an oppressive practice. So hopefully all of you will have an opportunity to read chapter 2 next week and hear some reflections for you. What are the several teaching methodologies discussed in chapter 2? Right? He labels them very clearly, right, for us and discusses them, right? What are the attitudes and practices of each of these methodologies? Right? And this is what we're going to discuss next week, even if you don't get to do this homework. Which of those practices do you recognize as dominant in the education system you grew up in? Right? So if there are two or several, which one did you experience when you went to school or when you didn't go to school? Right? And I'd love to hear from folks examples, like some concrete examples of of how this played out. So like one day I was in school and this happened, or there were these policies, and making them concrete so that we don't get into this generalization about, teachers are bad and students don't want to learn. That's not helpful. When I was in school, or my kids, when like my kids or my cousin or my brother or who, like this is what happened to them in school, and this is why it is an example of this particular methodology, of a principle or practice from that particular methodology that's outlined by Paulo Freire in chapter 2 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Right? And that's really it. And that's really it. Those are the reflections for last week. And that is going to bring us to a close of today's little conversation. I don't know. I guess call it a conversation because y'all were definitely talking over there. Um, and again, next week, I really do hope that some folks will come on and guest and offer your opinions. Chapter 2, I think people might find it a little bit easier of a way in. A huge theory about the world, a world view is presented in chapter 1. And it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. Right? I've read this numerous times and find new things always. Chapter 2, however, I think is a little bit more grounded. You will be able to find yourselves grounded in your own experience of the education system that you grew up in to be able to have more of a discussion about these things. And we'll be able to discuss a lot more from your first person experiences. So I'm hoping that we'll hear from more folks next week. Like I said, last week I said I might call some people. I might have to actually call up some people. I may be on you. You may get a phone call from me between now and next Sunday. But that's it. So that's it. All right. So the questions are, what are the several teaching methodologies discussed in chapter 2? I'll post these below, right? What are the attitudes and practices of each of these methodologies, and which of those practices do you recognize as the dominant in the education systems you grew up in or experience now? give some examples from your experience as part of that system. That's it for this video. Those of you watching on YouTube, like it if you like it, share, comment, subscribe. This is Reg signing off. Love yourselves. Peace.